Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hope you're all doing well. Happy Monday. It's 2 p.m. here in the UK and it's a very nice day in Northern England today. It feels a little bit like spring. Once again, had a bad day yesterday. Saturday was nice, Sunday was horrible, and it's nice again. So can't grumble. So we're here to talk about Kohberger today. I did say that I was going to do this. I did plan to do this yesterday, but I had a headache, but that's all gone now. So I am going to read the filing of Judge Hippler. That's Hippler, not Hitler. Hippler. Judge Hippler, his order to say, no, Kohberger defense, you can't have the IGG thrown out. IGG stays. IGG stays. Now, look, I'm going to be honest with you. The defense have got a very good point, a very good point, that there was some shady shenanigans that went on in this IGG. It's kind of, slowly come to light that there were some shady shenanigans. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. I'm not. Having said that, I do believe that Kohberger is factually guilty. Obviously, he's constitutionally and legally innocent till proven guilty in a court of law. It's my personal opinion that he's factually guilty. I do think they've got the right guy. I'll say that up front. But where the state crosses the line, when they cross the line to get to a suspect, it's a problem. It's a problem. However, I do think the judge's decision was the right one. I don't have to be happy with it, but I do think it was the right one. So we're going to talk about that. Now, I know a bunch of people have already read these documents. You may have even heard someone or more than one person read these documents. It is the last one of the latest document drop that I'm going to read. There are a couple of others, but I'm not going to bother reading those. And, some of it at least was covered in the Franks that I read on Saturday. So I'm not going to read those. And there's a 175-page transcript from the IGG hearing that was closed to the public. Judge Hippler has released the transcript of that for, presumably, for openness and transparency. I like it. I like it. So he has released that with a few redactions, but just, people's names, identifying information. But otherwise, it's all there. And I'm not going to read that one either. And again, I know a few people have read that one on their channels. So if you like to hear readings of those things, you don't have to look too far for those things. But yeah, we're here for the IGG. The reason why I want to read this one is just because I've got an interest in genetics. So, I understand the stuff. And I'm going to point out where there's been lines crossed. Not illegally, but still, it's a slippery slope. Then again, as I said, I do believe overall the judge has come out with the right decision. I can see why the defense were wanting the IGG thrown out, because they got to Kohberger's name through the IGG as a tip. So IGG got the tip, got his name, and then they were able to fit the puzzle pieces together. Once they got the name, they were able to find his phone. They were able to find where his phone had been and tie that in with the surveillance. They were able to ascertain that absolutely Brian Kohberger had a white Elantra. And oh, look, there's a white Elantra type of vehicle that did the rounds in Moscow and was driving around Pullman in the middle of the night. Now, look, without IGG, I do think they would have got to Kohberger. I do. Eventually. I think it would have taken them longer, but all the puzzle pieces were there. It would have just taken them longer. I think they resorted to shady shit to get this done quickly because they were under huge pressure. Like certainly Moscow Police Department were under a lot of pressure to get this solved. As it was a university for University of Idaho students, you would not believe how powerful universities are in local communities. Any town that has a university is a big employer. They bring in a lot of money for their communities, and they do hold a lot of power, more power than you'd ever imagine. I think I said this at the time. I'm sure I said this at the time before Kohberger was arrested, that they were going to get this solved. By hook or by crook, they're going to get this solved because the university want it solved. So there's that. So they were under a huge amount of pressure to get it solved as quickly as possible. And I think they cut some corners to do so. But it doesn't mean to say that they didn't get to the right man. I do think they got the right man. I do think that they would have got him, but it would have taken them longer because they'd have had to work out who drove that vehicle and work backwards from that. Because the vehicle that was seen around the area doing the loops, and then they were able to find that vehicle on other surveillance cameras, they'd have eventually got to him. But it may have taken them a lot longer. And the longer it takes, the more opportunities, there are to hide stuff and what have you. So there's that. But factually, I do think he is guilty. I do. Let's put it this way. I haven't seen any evidence to date that makes me doubt that. Honestly, I haven't seen any evidence to date. If evidence comes up at the trial or even before the trial that changes my mind, then absolutely I'll say so. Just because I think he's factually guilty today doesn't wed me in forever and a day. I'm not going to defend my position when there is evidence to the contrary. But at the moment, I don't see evidence to the contrary. I do see shady shenanigans, though. I do see shady shenanigans. Anyhow, let's see who's in the house. We got BGOG, we got RZTV, we got Angie Baby, we got Thunder Horse. Thank you for gifting one membership. That's very kind of you. Can I see who got that, given that it was beforehand? Grey Wolf Paranormal. Thank you so much. RZTV, Grey Wolf. If you've never been on, go and check out the members area. We've got members lives. We got little videos, bloopers, pictures, all sorts of stuff on there. We got Salty Sleuth. We got Lisa. We got Casey Marie. We got Mary, Jazz King. We got CW, Pincho, Laurie, Karen, Paper Chaser, Snappy Dragon, Tracy, Robin, Comrie, Aqua, Coffee Cup. All right. Let's go. Let us go. My only question is, did WSU officers notify Moscow on November 29th that they found Brian Kohberger's Elantra when they found it? They only had the car and took a look at his license. Bushy eyebrows. That's how they would have got him. Because you've got the white Elantra in Moscow, and then you've got a white Elantra at WSU. They just need to put the pieces together. Did they notify Moscow on November 29th? I can't remember what they said about that at the hearing. They discussed it at the hearing. Somebody else might be able to remember. I think they did. I think they did. I can't remember. I'd have to go back to the hearing. It's in the PCA that they did, yeah. It is in the PCA that they did. But Brett Payne, in the transcript, let me just show you. I said I wasn't going to read it. But let me just show you what Brett Payne says. And Brett Payne was the lead investigator at Moscow Police Department. Okay. So this is the closed hearing. This is the transcript from the closed hearing. And this is the evidentiary hearing on IGG. So this was like the Frank's evidentiary hearing on the IGG. So Judge Hippler has made his decision based on not only the filings, but also this IGG. Okay, so all right, so I was assigned lead detective after the first 24 hours in the case. So Q is Anne. Does that mean you have responsibility for the case? Yes, ma'am. Okay, as such, did you participate in a search? Yes, ma'am. And when was the first time you heard Brian Kohberger's name? The first time I heard Brian Kohberger's name was 19th of December. And what was that a result of? That was a result of investigative genetic genealogy that was being undertaken by the FBI. We had a phone call that evening and we were told Brian Kohberger's name. And before that, Mr. Kohberger was not on your radar. No, ma'am. So in the PCA, they absolutely did say. He said, I'm telling you, there was shady shit that went on. They had to fit the facts. In the PCA, there were certain times when they had to fit the facts. Okay, let's have a look here. This is the PCA. It's shady. Statement of Brett Payne. All right. Statement of Brett Payne. It's a slippery slope. I don't like it. I just don't like it. Okay, where's... It's a bit about the vehicle, isn't it? It's a long time since I read this. Okay, PCA. Suspect vehicle 1. All right. All right, so as part of the investigation, an extensive search, commonly referred to in law enforcement as a video canvas, was done in the area. Effort to locate the suspect vehicle, reviewed numerous videos that were collected and have conversations with other MPD, ISP and FBI agents. Review of camera footage indicated that a white sedan here after suspect vehicle 1 was observed traveling westbound in the 700 block of Indian Hills Drive in Moscow. Okay. Review of footage from multiple videos shows suspect vehicle 1. All right. And then they've got suspect vehicle 1. You see, all this driving round he did, this is how they would have got to him. What they had to do was put this vehicle together with the vehicle in Pullman. I need the date. I'm looking for the date. Here we go. So investigators were given access to video footage on the Washington State University campus located in Pullman. A review of that video indicated that approximately 2:44 a.m., a white sedan, which was consistent with the white Elantra. What was the date, though? It is in here, isn't it? Sure it is. So that's all he's driving about. Oh, here we go. Here's the dates. November 25th, MPD asked area law enforcement agencies to be on the lookout for a white Hyundai Elantra. On November 29th, at approximately 12:28 a.m., Washington State University police officer Daniel Tengo queried white Elantras registered at WSU. As a result of that query, he located a 2015 white Elantra with a Pennsylvania license plate. The vehicle was registered to Brian Kohberger, hereafter Kohberger. That same day, WSU Curtis woman looking for white Elantra located it. Officer Whiteman ran the car, blah, blah, blah. So, how come Brett Payne said that he didn't know Brian Kohberger's name before December 19th? I mean, by the time it was December 19th and you first heard of Brian Kohberger's name, had you reviewed videotapes? Yes, ma'am. How many hours? Don't remember a lot. In those videotapes, did you focus on any particular ones that was of interest to you? Yeah, first one. So that's video surveillance, Linda Lane, camera, Highway 95, Indian Hills. With those references in mind and keeping December 19th in mind, which of those cameras were your focus before you learned of Brian Kohberger's name? I would say all of them. I'm going to return to that in just a few minutes when you talk about the interviews. Did you interview any people? Yes, ma'am. From labs. She does get to it. She does. Okay. How was Brian Kohberger the name you received at a tip linked to the case? He wasn't until after December 19th. What item of evidence did they link Brian Kohberger to? I'm not sure what you're asking. As far as before December 19th, we didn't have one at that point. Why did you become interested in learning the identity of Brian Kohberger? Not quite sure I understand your question. We were interested in anyone who would have been involved in this. The DNA from the knife sheath was obviously the one thing we thought was a very strong piece of evidence in this case. So it was that particular piece we pursued as a potential avenue. Is it your understanding that the FBI's work said that it was Brian Kohberger's DNA? It's not my understanding, blah, blah, blah. All right, I don't know where it is. I want you to make sure I understand. Testimony. Were you not aware of? Oh, that's unknown mail B. All right, all right. Look. Brett Payne, as the lead investigator, should have known Brian Kohberger's name before December 19th if it's absolutely true that on November 29th, they got a tip from WSU saying that they had a 2015 white Elantra registered to one of their students known as Brian Kohberger. Anyhow, let's get into this. Oh, yeah. He's DNA matched. He's DNA matched. Absolutely 100%. He's DNA matched. This is what I'm saying. There's shady shenanigans that has gone on to get to Brian Kohberger. However, I think they would have got to him anyway. It just would have taken them longer. I do think they would have got to him anyway, despite the IGG. You see, the idea for the defence was if they throw out the IGG, they have to basically throw out everything. They have to throw out the case because it's fruit of the poisonous tree. Like without the IGG, the defence are arguing that they would have never got to Kohberger, and therefore everything that came after the IGG had to be thrown out, and that's the entire case. However, that's not how it reads in the PCA, because they also had the evidence from the white Elantra, like the surveillance cameras. They had the surveillance camera footage. That would have led them to him eventually. They were under a huge amount of pressure to get to the, an arrest, and that's why they cut corners. But it doesn't mean to say that they didn't get him, that they didn't get the right person, because I believe they did. Yes, 100%. It was 100%. It was 100% match. Yes. I mean, look, there can never be a 100%. It's like I think it was 1 in 5 and 27 zeros. That's what the chance was, that it was someone else's. They can't prove it's his car. Yeah, but the white Elantra registered at WSU would have given them his name. That's the thing. They might not be able to prove it's his car doing the rounds in Moscow, but what I'm saying is the white Elantra registered at WSU would have given them his name, and then once they've got his name, then they can tie his phone to the vehicle, and then they can find out where his family live. Then they can go and do the trash pull, and then they've got enough for the probable cause. They get there without the IGG. They would get there without the IGG. They were just, they cut corners to get this done quickly. He might not be the only one with a white Elantra, but it was the only one at WSU with a white Elantra who was who was in 1122 King Road that night. There was no one else with a white Elantra who was in 1122 King Road that night who left the DNA on the knife sheath. That's the issue. That's the issue. So why cut corners and hide the work of how they got to him? Because they knew that the IGG stuff was shady. So they didn't put it in the PCA because they knew it was shady. That's what they knew. They knew it was shady. They knew what was done wasn't. It wasn't that it was illegal. It wasn't illegal. It was just against FBI policy. That can't be proven. What can't be proven? That he was the only one with a white Elantra who was in 1122 King Road who left his DNA on a knife sheath? Yes, absolutely. That's proven. That's proven. There was no one else's DNA on that knife sheath. So it's not like there was 2 DNA profiles on that knife sheath, both people with white elantras. No, there was one person who, with that DNA on that knife sheath, who has a white elantra. Anyhow, let's read this. Okay, so this is the order, Judge Hippler's order on the defendant's motion to suppress the genetic information. Defendant is charged with 1 count of burglary and 4 counts of murder in the first degree. It's alleged that defendant entered a residence at 1122 King Road, Moscow, Idaho, in the early morning hours of November 13th, 2022, stabbed Maddie, Kaylee, Ethan, and Zanet with a knife. Left at the crime scene was a knife sheath, which single source male DNA was extracted using forensic investigative genetic genealogy, or IgG. Law enforcement was able to identify defendant as a possible suspect weeks after the crime occurred. Subsequently, law enforcement conducted a trash pull from defendant's family residence and obtained DNA tying defendant to the DNA found on the knife sheath. Defendant was subsequently arrested pursuant to a warrant and charged in this matter. Defendant asserts law enforcement violated his constitutional rights by failing to secure a warrant before conducting the IgG and trash pull. This is where the defense's argument completely falls. It falls right there, and Judge Hippler knew it. Judge Hippler knew it. They don't need a warrant to test DNA found at a crime scene, and they don't need a warrant to pull trash once that trash has been put outside, even if local ordinances say that only certain people can collect your trash. It's not illegal to go and take trash out of a bin or anywhere. If it's been discarded, it's considered abandoned. So you don't need a warrant for that. Sorry, don't need a warrant for that. He seeks to suppress all evidence obtained through these searches, as well as all evidence obtained through subsequent warrants as fruit of the poisonous tree. The state disputes that defendant's constitutional rights were violated. A suppression hearing was held on January 23rd, 2025, during which the court received testimony from members of law enforcement and experts in IgG, each of them whom the court found to be credible and reliable. Specifically, the court received testimony from Detective Corporal Brett Payne, Rylene Nolan, Matthew Gametti, Daniel Helwig, and Leah Larkin. Okay, those were, obviously, Brett Payne was the lead investigator, but some of these guys were genetics experts. Okay. The transcript is interesting. It's really interesting. Maybe I should read it, but it is interesting. All right. Following argument, the court took the matter under advisement. The court finds defendant has failed to demonstrate his constitutional rights were contravened by the IgG and trash pull, and therefore suppression is not warranted. The standard of review of a motion to suppress is bifurcated. Bifurcated. It's not a word I hear a lot, that. I don't know why. It's a good word. The power to assess the credibility of witnesses, resolve factual conflicts, weigh evidence, and draw factual inferences is vested in the trial court. State versus Valdez Molina, 1995. A trial court's ruling on a motion to suppress evidence combines the issue of law and fact, and the trial court's factual findings will not be overturned unless they are clearly onerous. Okay. When a decision on a motion to suppress is challenged, the application of constitutional principles to the facts found will be freely reviewed. Okay. These are the findings of fact that Judge Hippler has got here. All right. November 13th, 2022, law enforcement found the bodies of Maddie, Kaylee, Zana, and Ethan inside a residence located at 1122 King Road in Moscow, Idaho. All 4 victims died from apparent knife wounds. A K-bar knife sheath was found on a bed next to the bodies of Miss Morgan and Miss Gonzalez. Law enforcement seized the knife sheath and swabbed around the button of the sheath for DNA. A sample of DNA identified as Q1.1 was extracted from the swab by the Indiana State Police. No, not Indiana. Not Indiana, Michelle. When I'm talking about Indiana, I say Idaho. I'm used to saying Indiana State Police. Idaho State Police. Forensics lab and subsequently tested using standard STR, which stands for short tandem repeat methods. The STR profile developed revealed that the DNA came from a single source male profile. Law enforcement uploaded the DNA profile to CODIS, but it resulted in no hits to known offenders. What is CODIS? The Combined DNA Index System and National DNA Database. All right. National DNA Database. I think in the UK, I think we just call it the National DNA Database. Like, we don't have a cool acronym at all. It's just but in the US, it's called CODIS. All right. So law enforcement, uploads DNA to CODIS. You've got crime scene DNA. They upload it to CODIS to see if it's already in there. Because if somebody's committed a felony or there's various other reasons why they might have DNA in CODIS, and if there's a match, great. If there's a match, that's it, done, dusted. But Kohberger had never committed any crimes previous. Got an infraction, traffic stuff, but clean records, so his profile wasn't in CODIS. So they had to try, this is where the IGG comes in, they had to try to match this DNA to a name a different way. Subsequently, law enforcement made the decision to pursue forensic investigative genetic genealogy, IGG, on Q1.1. Such testing begins with the generation of large amount of raw sequencing data from the DNA sample, which is then organized into SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms. So it's a different type of testing than STR testing, completely different. And I've got videos explaining the differences between them, so I'm not going to go into that here. Using bioinformatics software, the SNPs associated with ancestry and genealogy can then be pulled out of the raw data and organized into a SNP profile that can, in turn, be uploaded to commercial genetic genealogy databases to search for a genetic match. Depending on the strength of the match, law enforcement can start building a family tree to identify potential genetic relatives of the uploaded SNP profile. A sidebar, but it's relevant. Just last night, right, I found that the sister of one of my second times great-grandfathers, who I thought died in childhood, I've never been able to find any death records for her, but I haven't been able to find any living records for her either. So I just assumed that she died and she died in infancy. But no, because I got a DNA match on Ancestry with a fourth cousin who I do not know. I've got loads of like second cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins that come up on my Ancestry hits, and our common ancestor was my 3 times great grandmother, and my fourth cousin is has originated from Martha, who I thought died in childhood, but no, she didn't. So I've now got the entire link. It's just last night. Interesting. All right. These genetic genealogy databases are hosted by private companies and populated by hundreds of thousands of members of the public. It's up to millions now, millions of people. have submitted their DNA to ancestry databases, who voluntarily submit their own DNA and publicly shared information to allow the database to better match them to potential genetic relatives. Notably, at all relevant times, only 2 commercial genetic genealogy databases permitted searches by law enforcement. However, they can't stop them. This is one of the issues. I think this is going to be a sticky issue for a long time to come. It's like the battle between private companies saying that we're not going to let law enforcement use your DNA, and then law enforcement coming along and using that DNA database. Well, what can the private company do about it? Sue the FBI? What can they do? What can they do? You know, a private company will say, we do not permit law enforcement to test, you know, using our databases. But how do they know? How do they even know it's happening? They don't. They don't. So listen, if you've submitted your DNA to any database and you think, if you are naive enough to think that the terms of service will apply forevermore and in every single circumstance, you are, I don't know, born yesterday. Right? Because they can change their terms and conditions at any time. And what you can do is delete your sample. You can delete your profile. It doesn't guarantee that your sample's gone. It just means that it can't be searched from the public, you know, the front facing of the website. But if you've submitted your DNA to any DNA database, don't think that you've got privacy just because that company says you have. That's just silly. Anyhow, if you don't want it, if you don't want, you know, law enforcement to potentially have your DNA, then don't submit your DNA to any genealogy database. Just don't do it. Simple as that. Don't do it. All right. Okay, so only 2 commercial genetic genealogy databases permitted searches by law enforcement: Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch Pro. The databases MyHeritage and GEDmatch purportedly to disallow such searches. MyHeritage is rubbish. I did MyHeritage, and that's just like, it's not, no. If you are going to submit your DNA, either use Ancestry.com or 23andMe. Those are the 2 biggest ones. Those are the most accurate. And neither of those allow law enforcement to use their service. But how can you stop them? Anyhow, the IgG process essentially attempts to ascertain identity through genetic associations. Unlike STR profiles, which can only reveal whether a person is genetically male or genetically female, that's not true. That's not true at all. That's not true. What it can do, I mean, yes, it can, just on the face of it, you say, oh yeah, that's a genetic male, that's a genetic female. But compared to another sample, it can tell you how closely matched that sample is with the sample that you're testing against. Anyhow, SNPs in their raw form have the ability to reveal a trove of personal information, including sensitive health information, such as whether the person has traits indicating an increased risk for cancer or Alzheimer's. He's playing it down a bit here. That's very complicated. I'm tempted, but I'm not gonna. However, IgG does not target these particular SNPs because, according to defense expert Daniel Hellwig, they are neither relevant nor probative nor appropriate to the identification process. In fact, gleaning medical information from SNPs is not possible for a layperson to do and would take a forensic scientist like Mr. Hellwig a lot of research. Okay. All right. I'll let him have that. As a defence expert, Leah Larkin noted, however, it is possible for a person to upload a SNP profile to a third-party site called Prometheus, which for a fee will look for medically informative SNPs within the profile and generate a health report. There's no evidence or contention it was done here. No, they're not interested in Kohberger's health. They're not. They're not interested in his health. They're interested in his name, like his identity. That's what they're interested in. So any discussion about health is just a moot point. It's erroneous. It's a red herring. They're just interested in his ID. Who is this guy who left this DNA on this knife sheath at the crime scene? The IgG was first performed by Othram Labs, a company in which the Idaho Department of Purchasing had an existing contract for such work. Othram was asked to develop a SNP profile from Q1.1 upload to those public genealogy databases permitted law enforcement entry and submit a preliminary report of its findings. Othram was not asked to ascertain medical information associated with Q1.1, nor is there any evidence it tested for such. Law enforcement did not obtain a warrant for Othram's work, nor did they need one. Because that DNA had been collected from a crime scene. The Idaho State Police delivered Q1.1 to Othram on November 22nd, 2022. Othram developed a SNP profile from Q1.1 and searched family tree DNA and GEDmatch Pro. Matthew Gametti, the systems director for the Idaho State Police Forensic Lab, testified that Othram searched two databases that allowed law enforcement searches, but then named GEDmatch as one of the two databases searched, which does not permit law enforcement searches. He later clarified that GEDmatch has two databases, GEDmatch and GEDmatch Pro, only the latter of which allows law enforcement searches. Thus, given Mr. Gametti's clarification, it's apparent that Othram searched GEDmatch Pro, not GEDmatch. You see, Othram is a private company in itself. Right, it's a private company offering forensic services. So if they went against the terms of service of, let's say, they decided to start uploading profiles to 23andMe, which absolutely does not allow law enforcement to use their service. If they did it, then 23andMe could come along and sue them, because they've broken their terms of service. They could come along and civilly file and say, you've broken our terms of service. Our customers' privacy has been called into question, and this is a big deal. We want to protect our customers' privacy, and we absolutely do not allow you to use 23andMe for work that you are doing with law enforcement. But if law enforcement do it, what are they going to do? And this is where things become shady. All right. The Idaho State Police delivered Q1. Oh, I've read that. This work revealed 4 brothers of interest. These brothers did not share defendant's last name. So 4 brothers of interest, all of whom were low matches to Q1.1. So I assume that those 4 brothers would have maybe been distant cousins of Brian Kohberger. Like, if they came up as low matches to Q1.1, which we know is Brian Kohberger's DNA, then low match, depends how low. Depends how many centimorgans they share, but we don't know that. Answer. So I'm assuming that these 4 brothers are maybe distant cousins of the Kohberger family. Probably may not even know them at all. Like all the second cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins that I found on ancestry databases, I don't know them. I have no idea who they are. No idea who they are. All right. To further its family tree building, Othram asked the Idaho State Police to contact one of the identified brothers to provide a DNA sample to upload into either of those two databases. Why? Why would they need to? Why would they need to? Because they've already ascertained that those brothers' DNA contains a low match. Why would they need to? Anyhow, despite Idaho State Police's request, the contacted brother declined to provide a sample. All right. So that lead is kind of like done. We've got these four brothers. They're a low match, so they're not our guys. They're not our guys. They're the two lower match. They're not our guys. We need a 100%. We need a 100%. Using a SNP profile, we need a 100%. You know, this is not probability. This is not like STR testing where you're comparing one sample against another and the probability that these two, you know, are the same person. You know, that's what you're working with STR. But with SNP profiling, because you're looking at thousands of individual points on the genome, you need it to be 100% to say this is the same person. Or 50% if, you know, it's a parent-child relationship. Okay. All right. December 10th, 2022. This is where shady shenanigans begins. Members of law enforcement, including the FBI, had a meeting to discuss Othram's work. As a result, a decision was made to turn the IGG work over to the FBI, who can do shady shit without the fear of being sued. Although it shouldn't be the case. They should sue the FBI. They should sue the FBI for doing this. It's not a criminal offence to do this, but the FBI are going against the terms of service of the companies that they, unbeknownst to those companies, work with. No, there's no question that it was that Brent Kohberger guy. No. Okay. All right. That same day, Othram was instructed to stop work and turn over its SNP profile and search results to the Idaho State Police. Othram did so along with a preliminary report of its findings. The preliminary report did not contain any medical information associated with the SNP profile, and nor would it. They're not looking for health conditions, they're looking for an identity. The Idaho State Police then turned the information over to the FBI, which was able to use Othram's profile to develop a significantly larger SNP profile. Well, no, it was the same SNP profile. What they were able to do was get more matches to that SNP profile. That's what they were able to do because they did shady shit. That's why the FBI uploaded the largest SNP profile. No, the SNP profile is the same. They uploaded the SNP profile to multiple genetic genealogy databases, including GEDmatch and MyHeritage. So these two companies, GEDmatch Pro allows law enforcement to use its data, but GEDmatch doesn't. Neither does MyHeritage. Neither do any of the other sites that they could have used. Like, as they were using GEDmatch and MyHeritage, why didn't they just go the whole hog and do 23andMe and Ancestry.com as well? If they're going to break terms of service of two companies, they might as well break terms of service of the two biggest companies. I don't know. Maybe even the FBI are not going to step over that particular line. Who knows? Which purports to disallow law enforcement searches. Maybe the FBI regularly uses these two and have never been caught out before. Then maybe that's why. Maybe they think, oh, well, you know, these two, they're smaller databases. They're not going to notice that we're making fake profiles. This is what they're doing. They're making fake profiles, pretending to be individuals. And then the DNA that they're submitting is, I know why. I know why they're not going to use 23andMe and Ancestry, because you have to literally send your spit in. Right. You literally have to send your spit in to Ancestry and 23andMe. But with MyHeritage, GEDmatch, there's a bunch of others now that you can have an existing profile and you can just upload it, like for a few quid. You can just upload it. So let's say, for example, if you've done 23andMe, but then you want to test using MyHeritage, you don't have to spit in a tube and send it off to MyHeritage to have that, you know, all started from scratch. You can download your profile from 23andMe and then upload it to MyHeritage. So that's why. You know what these companies should do? If they want to stop law enforcement, you know what they should do? They should stop that. They should say, no, if you want to use our service, you have to literally spit in a tube or do a cheek swab, whichever one they prefer, and send it in to us. We're no longer allowing you to upload your profile. That would stop law enforcement. There you go. I've solved the problem for them. I don't know why they don't. Maybe it's because it's more costly to actually do that testing, and rather than just allowing people to upload profiles. But if they're gonna do that, if they're gonna continue to allow people to upload profiles, then surely they have got to acknowledge the fact that law enforcement could do shady shit perfectly legally. They can do shady shit. It's not a criminal offence to do this. All right. Which purports to disallow law enforcement searches. At the time, the FBI had an interim policy issued by the United States Department of Justice related to IgG analysis and searches by its agencies. So Exhibit D19. On the one hand, the interim policy required that investigative agencies conduct IgG searches in genetic genealogy databases permitted by law enforcement use. However, on the other hand, the interim policy also stated it was intended only as per internal guidance. So, you know, we recommend that our agencies don't use private companies who tell their users that they don't allow law enforcement to use their databases. But there's nothing really to stop you, because there's nothing in law to prevent you from doing it. There's nothing in law to prevent you from making a profile on MyHeritage. You can call yourself any name you want. Do it. Do it. You can call yourself, if you've done 23andMe or Ancestry, download your profile, go to MyHeritage, create a completely fake name, and upload your DNA. You can absolutely do that for a handful of dollars. I think it's about $10, maybe. You can do that. There's no law against it. So the fact that the FBI do this, I reckon they do this all the time. I reckon the reason why we know about this is because this is like a high-profile case. They probably do this all the time. So MyHeritage and GEDmatch actually are on a very sticky wicket here, because their users could come along and say, hold on a minute, in our terms of service, you say that you don't allow law enforcement to use your databases, which includes my DNA, and therefore I'm going to remove myself from your database. And MyHeritage would just go, well, that's your choice then. Is it going to prevent people from using their service in the future? It might prevent some, but look, who reads the small print? Who reads the small print on any of these things? So the real issue here isn't about Brian Kohberger. The real issue here is what are these companies going to do about the policies they have, which essentially are now lying to their customers. Because if they know that law enforcement are creating fake profiles and using their database to get matches for criminal cases, MyHeritage, GEBmatch, and all the others need to either stop them doing it by disallowing people to create fake profiles and upload DNA that could quite frankly be anybody's. Right, you could swab your next door neighbour. Your next door neighbour could be asleep, right, in a garden chair, right, with their mouth open. And you could go in, swab their cheek, right, and send it off to MyHeritage and put a fake profile up. In fact, if you did that, you could do that to 23andMe as well. Now, I don't know if there's laws against that, like stealing people's DNA while they're asleep in a garden chair. I'd like to think there would be. But I don't know what that is. I don't know what that law is. So, you know, MyHeritage, GEBmatch, the others, what are they going to do about this? Are they going to continue? Now they know that this is happening. They know that the FBI did this in Kohberger's case. Are they going to continue to lie to their customers, or are they going to do something about it? And the thing that they need to do is stop people uploading profiles, uploading DNA samples for a tenner and making fake profiles. That's what they need to do. That would solve the problem. But in terms of the way that the FBI have dealt with the DNA from the knife sheath, they've not done anything wrong. Legally, they've not done anything wrong. It's shady that they've gone against their own quote unquote guidance to get to Kohberger, to get an ID on the knife sheath stuff. But you think, well, you know, this is a quadruple murderer. Very vicious. We need this guy off the streets. We need the University of Idaho to stop badgering us. We're going to do a little bit of shady stuff. We're going to go against our own quote-unquote guidance, and we're going to submit this DNA profile to a couple of databases that don't allow law enforcement to do so. That's what's happened. Okay. All right. So, doesn't impose any legal restrictions on investigative agencies, noting the interim policy is not intended to, does not, and may not be relied upon to create any substantive or procedural rights or benefits enforceable to law or in equity or any party against the United States or its department agencies, entities, officers, blah, blah, blah. The interim policy does not impose any legal limitations on otherwise lawful investigative or prosecutorial activities or techniques utilized by the Department of Justice or limit the prerogatives, choices, or decisions available to or made by the department in its discretion. So, because they've not broken the law, and they've got to Kohberger, in my opinion, despite it being shady, despite it being uncomfortable that they did this, despite it being, despite it feeling like this is a slippery slope, the actual problem is with the private companies who allow law enforcement to get to criminal profiles by using their databases when they tell their customers that law enforcement don't use their databases. That's what's really shady, in my opinion. However, carry on. We're only on page 4. Thought we could do this quite quickly, but clearly not. From the information it acquired through the database search, the FBI was able to build a family tree and arrive at a potential match. There's no evidence that in developing the larger SNP profile, it's the same SNP profile you're talking about, the FBI targeted or even had access to those SNPs that can reveal sensitive health information. They're not interested in the SNPs that tell you that you're a carrier for X disease or that you've got a higher chance of getting high cholesterol. They're not interested in that. They're interested in the ID. Right. December 19th, 2022, the FBI provided defendant's name to Idaho law enforcement as a potential source of the DNA. But if you listen to the PCA, as we've already seen, well, they apparently had Kohberger's name anyway. They apparently had Kohberger's name from November 29th. So you want to believe that? I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. The FBI instructed that the identification of defendant as a person of interest was only as a tip. No warrant was obtained for the FBI's work, and subsequent warrants applications did not include the IgG results to inform probable cause. Didn't need warrants, though. As the investigation ensued, law enforcement discovered that defendant had driven from Pullman, Washington to his parents' home in a gated community in Monroe County, Pennsylvania. At the time, Monroe County's municipal waste ordinance required homeowners to dispose of their garbage by placing it out for collection or delivering it directly to a licensed waste hauler. Only an authorized trash collector could collect garbage left out for collection. However, if some random person comes along, right, let's say you put your bin out, right, so they've got to, like, probably do what we do. We've got to, like, wheel it out to the curb. Or for me, because I don't live near a curb, I live, like, there's, like, a track that goes down to where I live, and we just basically put it outside the gate, and they collect it from there, right? So there's a designated person, company that comes on Thursday to empty your bins. But if someone in the night came along and emptied my bin and it wasn't the trash company, would I be able to do anything about that? No, because I've abandoned that trash. Once it's put out, it's abandoned. Once it's put out of your immediate property, it's abandoned. Okay, law enforcement decided to conduct a warrantless trash pull from the Kohberger residence. Arrangements were made with the local trash collector to isolate and turn over the Kohberger's garbage to law enforcement for testing. That's clever. I really don't see anything wrong with this at all. I really don't. They did nothing wrong here. This is trash that has been abandoned, that is picked up by the trash collector. Once it's picked up by the trash collector, do you have any idea where your trash goes? Do you care? No. The fact that law enforcement are going to rifle through it, well, no, it's inconsequential because it's abandoned. You don't need a warrant for it. It's abandoned. If you're committing crimes, right, don't put your trash out for collection, just in case law enforcement might be on your tail. All right, take it somewhere else. Get rid of it. Burn it. All right, articles of trash were retrieved and sent to the Idaho State Police Forensic Lab to conduct standard DNA testing. A DNA profile developed from one article of trash was determined to be from the biological father of source Q1.1. Another article of trash revealed a mixture of male and female DNA. Okay, so maybe that's a mixture of his mother and father's DNA, presumably, because he's got a mother and a father. Okay. According to defendant expert Gary Schulter, PhD, the male DNA from the mixture was consistent with Q1.1. Okay. And that's the affidavit of G. Schulter, December 19th. Importantly, defendant had not claimed ownership or knowledge of the knife sheath from which Q1.1 was taken. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if Kohberger went to the police and said, has anybody turned in a knife sheath? Has anybody found a knife sheath? Like, I don't know, on the floor, on the ground somewhere. Do you have in your possession a knife sheath I might have dropped? No, of course he's not going to claim ownership of it because he abandoned it at a crime scene. So there you go. You don't need a warrant for a knife sheath that you forgot to take from a crime scene, nor do you need a warrant to collect trash that has been abandoned. All right, number 7. Because the DNA was a mixture, the Idaho State Police Forensic Lab standards and protocols prevented it from doing a manual comparison of the male DNA. All right. So the piece of trash that had a mixture of most probably his mother and father's DNA wasn't used. But they already had a piece that just had his father's DNA. I bet they were using like drink bottles, probably. They're a good place to get DNA from. Okay. After obtaining a search warrant, law enforcement collected DNA from a buccal swab obtained from the defendant. So this is once they've arrested him. Once they've arrested him, then they can get his DNA. A traditional STR DNA comparison was done between the Q1.1 profile and defendant's DNA. You see, once they've arrested him, then they can do just a standard test that is under absolutely, there's zero problem with doing this, right? Once they've arrested him, cigarette butts as well, cigarette butts. Once they've arrested him, they can just do the standard DNA testing, STR testing that has been done since DNA testing in laboratories became very common, like from the 1980s onwards. It's traditional STR testing. They get Kohberger's DNA from a cheek swab, and then they compare it with the DNA on the knife sheath. And that came back a 5 and 27 zeros. All right, 5, 27 zeros chance that wasn't Brian Kohberger's DNA. So, like I've been saying, that knife sheath contained Brian Kohberger's DNA without a shadow of a doubt. That was Brian Kohberger's DNA. There we go. So specifically, defendant was 5.37 octillion times more likely to have be the source of the Q1.1 profile than an unrelated individual randomly selected from the general population. Defendant was subsequently charged in this case. Idaho Constitution provides protection from lawful search and seizures as well, which defendant cites as an additional basis for his motion. However, with the exception of the trash pull argument set forth, opening memorandum, defendant does not explain how Idaho's Constitution provides greater protection than the Fourth Amendment, or otherwise explain how the application of the Donato favor. Well, I don't understand that, but anyway. All right, conclusions of law. Thank you, Stardust Shorty, for being a member for 28 months. 2-year-old granddaughter Sierra, watch the replay. You got a 2-year-old in the house. I don't blame you for watching the replay, but thank you for being a member for 28 months. So 3 DNA profiles all go back to Q1.1. Yes. So you've got the straight comparison between Brian Kohberger's buccal swab, cheek swab, and Q1.1. That was 5.37 octillion times more likely to be the source of the Q1.1 profile than an unrelated individual from the general population. You've got Michael Kohberger's DNA being a 50% match for it. So that proves that Michael Kohberger is a close relative of the Q1.1 profile. As it turns out, it's his dad. And then you've got the SNP profile, which is from Q1.1, which when they did the genealogical stuff, got them to Brian Kohberger. So 3 different ways they matched Q1.1 with Brian Kohberger. The people who tell me that that DNA is not Brian Kohberger's, I just don't know what to tell you. I'm just going to look at you very sympathetically because clearly you've got a problem with your brain that you probably need to get help for. But people do. People do. Do you know what I got called this morning in my comments? a comment left on the live stream I did the other day on the Franks. Right. I got called a pro-burger. Pro-burger. It's like, no, you obviously did not spend 3 hours of your life listening to that video. And you only probably needed to watch the first 10 minutes of me saying, I believe that Brian Kohberger is factually guilty. But no, someone just comes along and makes a random comment, clearly without even watching the video. We're not even watching the first 10 minutes of the video. Okay, conclusions of law. The Fourth Amendment of the United States protects the rights of people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. In seeking suppression of evidence based on a warrantless search, the defendant bears the evidentiary burden to show that he has a legitimate expectation of privacy in the item or place searched. This involves 2-part inquiry. 1, did the defendant have a subjective expectation of privacy in the object of the challenged search? And 2, is society willing to recognize that expectation as reasonable? The former is a question of fact, the latter a question of law. When a defendant makes such a showing, the burden will shift to the state to show an exception to the warrant requirement exists, or that the search was reasonable under the circumstances. State versus Rebo, 2021. That's a new case law. Here, defendant challenges 3 alleged unlawful DNA-related searches. 1, the development of a SNP profile from Q1.1, which was the now sheaf left by Brian Kohberger at the crime scene. The trash bull from the Kohberger residence and subsequent DNA test thereon. And Brian Kohberger has absolutely no right to privacy from somebody seizing his parents' trash. It's not even his trash. So he can't make that argument anyway. It's his parents' trash. His parents would have to make the argument that they'd had the Fourth Amendment right infringed. Not him. Not him. Anyhow. And 3, the search of the commercial genetic databases using the SNP profile. It seeks to suppress not only the genetic information obtained by law enforcement, but all other evidence obtained as a result of the alleged illegality. While property interests are also protected under the Fourth Amendment, defendant has not alleged violation of such interests. Defendant asserts that all evidence collected after he was identified through the FBI's IgG search, i.e. December 19th, must be suppressed as fruit of the poisonous tree. That's what they're getting at. All right. In response, the state argues defendant had not met his threshold burden of demonstrating that a constitutional violation occurred with regards to any of the 3 searches. The state is correct. And in this instance, they are. Defendant has not established a Fourth Amendment violation with regards to the development of the SNP profile. Defendant first asserts that the extraction and testing of DNA from the SNP from the sheath to develop the SNP profile constituted an unreasonable search mandating suppression. Noting recent advances have made DNA capable of revealing prolific and sensitive information, as well as the fact that humans continually shed DNA into the environment, defendant asked this court to find that he had a reasonable expectation of privacy in his DNA, the testing of which through SNP methods required a warrant, despite the fact that law enforcement was lawfully in possession of the object containing the DNA, i.e. the sheath, that he left at a crime scene. Sorry, no takebacks. When you leave something at a crime scene, you can't come crying saying they need a warrant to test that item. I'm sorry. No. No. Simply no. I'd have just wrote, no, denied. I'd have done a Judge Goal at this point. Judge Hippler is he's very detailed, he's very comprehensive, and he spends his time. Judge Goal would have just gone denied without hearing, as we all know. He further posits that this privacy interest is not subject to the doctrine of abandonment because the shedding of DNA into the environment is not a voluntary or knowing act. So he's admitted he was there. He's admitted he was there. Does he realise? Does the defence realise that by saying we need this DNA suppressing, we need this DNA that I shed at this crime scene onto the sheath, I need that suppressing because that was my DNA. He's now admitted that he was there. He's admitted that it was his DNA. Brilliant. Well done, Brian. Well done, Anne. All right. The state denies that the testing of the DNA from the sheath was a search, pointing out that the DNA was lawfully seized from the scene of a crime. The state further contends defendant has not demonstrated he has a reasonable expectation of privacy in this DNA because he abandoned it, and or because he has not shown the existence of a reasonable privacy interest society is willing to recognise. Yeah, exactly. You've admitted your DNA was at that crime scene. You can't now come bleating to us saying that we needed a warrant to test your DNA that you left at a crime scene. Sorry. The fact that you've now admitted to being at the crime scene means that we all know. We all know that you're lying, Brian. We know that you're lying about stargazing, Brian. All right. This is a matter of first impression in Idaho. However, applying well-settled principles of Fourth Amendment law, the court finds no constitutional violation. First, the defendant abandoned any privacy interest in his DNA by disclaiming knowledge of ownership of the sheath from which the DNA was extracted. Yeah, I don't know whose sheath that was, but I've clearly got an interest in that DNA that was found on that sheath, that was found at that crime scene, because I'm saying my constitutional rights have been violated. If that's not your DNA and not your knife sheath, then you're not going to argue a constitutional problem, are you? No, okay. All right, moving on. Second, even if no such abandonment occurred, there is no reasonable expectation of privacy in DNA found at a crime scene, which is subsequently analysed to protect an unknown suspect. Defendant cannot establish a subjection expectation of privacy in the DNA found on the sheath due to abandonment. It's well settled that a person who voluntarily abandons property prior to a search cannot be said to possess the requisite privacy interest under the Fourth Amendment. When one abandons property, there can be nothing unlawful in the government's appropriation of such abandoned property. Look, they got Rex Hillerman's pizza box out of a trash can in the street after he was feeding his face, and they took out of that pizza box a crust and got his DNA from that crust. So, perfectly lawful. Perfectly lawful. In the Fourth Amendment context, abandonment occurs through words, acts, and other objective facts indicating that the defendant voluntarily discarded, left behind, or otherwise relinquished his or her interest in his or her property. Disclaiming ownership or knowledge of an item constitutes abandonment. For example, officers reported to defendant's house after reports of a fight. So this is obviously another case. All right, so this is State versus Melling, 2016. While officers were speaking to the defendant, his girlfriend gave officers a lockbox that she said belonged to the defendant. The defendant told officers he had never seen the box before, had no idea who it belonged to, and nothing in the box was his, and that he did not know what was inside it. The court held that by disclaiming ownership of the lockbox and its contents, the defendant abandoned any privacy interest therein. Love it. Moreover, a person need not specifically disclaim knowledge or ownership of the contents of a container to result in abandonment thereof. It is sufficient to disclaim knowledge or ownership of the container itself. By denying ownership of the bag in response to the officer's inquiry prior to the search, the defendant essentially relinquished or abandoned any privacy interest in the contents of the bag. All right, so he's done exactly that. Wasn't me, I wasn't there. While subsequently saying, that's my DNA and I therefore need it protecting. All right. There's no dispute here that defendant has not claimed any knowledge or ownership of the sheath, thus resulting in its abandonment. Defendant concedes as much, but argues that abandonment of any privacy interest in the sheath did not result in the abandonment of the DNA found on the sheath. He contends that unlike the voluntary act leaving the sheath, leaving DNA on the sheath is not voluntary, because a person has no way to know that their DNA has been left behind. DNA, he points out, is shed everywhere. So you admit being there, because it's not shedding in a room where a double murder's taking place if you weren't there. All right. Humans have no ability to keep their biological material from their environment. Consequently, he reasons the finding of that DNA on the sheath was abandoned would mean that a person voluntarily gave up privacy of their entire genetic makeup every time they interact with the public. Okay, I guess they do. In support of his argument, defendant relies exclusively on a concurring opinion in State versus Carbo, which is factually similar to this case. In Carbo, the evidence at issue was semen deposited inside the deceased crime victim and skin scrapings from underneath their fingernails. In an attempt to identify a suspect, law enforcement contracted with a lab to conduct a genetic analysis of the DNA extracted from this evidence. Like here, the lab created a SNP profile from the DNA and utilized commercial genealogical databases to determine a potential source. It also generated a report that provided information about the suspect's physical traits and ancestral origin. This information ultimately led law enforcement to the defendant. Law enforcement then created a DNA profile from trash discarded by the defendant, which matched the DNA profile from the crime scene. Subsequently, the defendant provided a voluntary DNA sample, which matched the profile from the crime scene and the garbage. The defendant moved to suppress evidence of his genetic information left behind at the crime scene. He argued, as defendant does here, that although he may have abandoned his privacy interests in his semen and his skin cells, it did not equate to an abandonment of the vast troves of genetic information that biological material contained. Oh dear. Dear. Making short work of this argument, the Minnesota Supreme Court found that by voluntarily leaving his semen and skin at the crime scene, he abandoned any subjective privacy interest in his genetic information contained therein. Dear God, I can't believe people make these claims, honestly. I mean, it's worth a try. In the concurring opinion relied on by defendant, one justice disagreed with the majority on this issue because, given the sensitive genetic information revealed by SNP testing, he would have required a warrant before allowing such testing. He further opined that the concept of abandonment, which requires voluntariness, is an ill fit for genetic information because it's virtually impossible for humans to prevent leaving personal genetic information everywhere they go. To this end, he analogized DNA to the cell phone site location information at issue in United States, Carpenter versus United States, where the United States Supreme Court reasoned that cell site location information is not voluntarily exposed, given that virtually any activity on a phone, which is essential to participate in modern life, will leave a trail of location data. While there are safeguards to prevent the dissemination of CSLI, i.e. turning off a phone, he observed, there is no similar safeguards for DNA, thus rendering the case against abandonment all the more clear. When we venture into public spaces, we simply cannot help shed our DNA. The majority of the justices, however, pointed out that the inquiry as to whether the defendant abandoned his subjective privacy interests looked to his specific actions. When viewed in this way, the majority found Justice Procurini's logic inapt, given that the defendant's DNA was not collected from a shed skin cell or flake of dandruff, nor was it mere consequence of the defendant venturing into a public sphere. It was collected from semen he voluntarily left inside the victim and skin cells he voluntarily left under her fingernails. So he left it at a crime scene. You leave skin, leave your body, parts of your body at a crime scene, then nobody needs a warrant to test it. Go away. Defendant argues that Justice Procacini, case against abandonment is particularly appropriate here. Defendant argues the biological material left on the sheath was not blood or semen or some bodily fluid that the Kohberger court found could voluntarily be left behind. Instead, he argues it was more likely shed cells, which humans cannot help but discard. Yes, but it was on the sheath of a knife used to murder people. So you're admitting that your DNA is on that sheath. If you continue to logically work this argument through, you're admitting that's your DNA. However, as the state points out, there is nothing that distinguishes semen voluntarily left at a crime scene from the sheath. Both were abandoned, carrying DNA. Stated another way, the semen in Kohberger and the sheath here are both containers of DNA. As discussed, disclaiming ownership or knowledge of a container results in abandonment of a privacy interest in its contents. Thus, by effectively disclaiming knowledge or ownership of the sheath, defendant necessarily abandons any privacy interest in the DNA it contains. Indeed, Kohberger is not an anomaly in finding abandonment. Courts uniformly hold that a person abandons any privacy interest in their DNA for purposes of the Fourth Amendment when they abandon property that contains their DNA. In State versus Burns, for example, law enforcement extracted DNA from blood-stained dress of the victim and claimed created a genetic profile which was run through genetic genealogy. The defendant was identified as a suspect through this process. Officers then followed him to a restaurant and collected a straw the suspect deposited in the trash. Testing of the DNA on the straw indicated that the DNA extracted from the dress could be defendant. Subsequent tests confirmed it. The defendant did not move to suppress the extraction analysis of his DNA from the blood-stained dress, but he did unsuccessfully seek suppression of the DNA extracted from the straw. On appeal, the court had little difficulty finding any privacy interest he had in his DNA profile developed from the straw was abandoned. First, by failing to make any effort to preserve the straws private, he relinquished any subjective privacy interest herein. Second, even if he retained a subjective privacy interest, it was not one society would recognize as reasonable, considering he voluntarily left the straw behind in a restaurant. Further, court rejected the defendant's attempt to distinguish the DNA on the straw from the straw itself, finding no practical difference between the two. By abandoning the straw, he abandoned any DNA on the straw. All right, I'm not going to read all that, but that's similar cases. The Burns court additionally rejected the argument defendant makes here. The DNA cannot voluntarily be abandoned due to involuntary shedding. In doing so, the court aptly allergenized, I don't know how to say that, DNA shed from fingerprints, something individuals also unconsciously and continually shed. First, the court observed all the different ways a person can shed DNA is irrelevant. for Fourth Amendment purposes. What is relevant is the DNA left on a particular item the defendant abandoned, a straw, or here, the sheath. Second, the court noted that DNA shed is no different than latent fingerprints. Like DNA, latent fingerprints are left, typically, without volition, everywhere humans go. Yeah. When the judge questioned Ann Taylor about how different this is from fingerprints, her argument was really bad. It was really bad. Really bad. Like DNA, they are powerful means of individual identification, not visible to the human eye, and must be developed through the use of specialized technology. The court concluded that because the testing of latent fingerprints does not raise Fourth Amendment concerns, neither should DNA collected and tested from an abandoned item. The court finds that the analysis in Burns compelling and consistent with Fourth Amendment law. The court recognizes that a distinction can be drawn given the fact that in Burns there was no question that the defendant abandoned the straw, and here defendant argues it cannot be conclusively stated he abandoned the sheath. However, as the state notes, this distinction does not preclude a finding of abandonment for two reasons. First, as discussed, abandonment does not occur solely by discarding an item. It also occurs by disclaiming ownership or knowledge, or otherwise relinquishing an interest in the property. Yeah, you say, well, it's not mine because I wasn't there. Well, why are you here arguing about it then? If it's not yours, why are you arguing about it? You're only arguing about it because it's yours. And by arguing about it, you are effectively saying that it's yours. You can't win, can you, Mr. Kohberger? Because it's your DNA and it was your knife that murdered those people. All right. By not claiming ownership of the sheath or any knowledge as to how his DNA arrived on the sheath, defendant abandoned any privacy interest in the DNA. Second, the fact that a person does not knowingly expose his DNA to the public does not contravene a finding of abandonment. Like DNA, fingerprints and bodily fluids are left unknowingly on surfaces of public places merely as a consequence of venturing into the public sphere. Yet, as noted in Burns, this does not raise constitutional concerns. The manner in which humans shed cellular material is not fundamentally different from the manner in which the oils comprising fingerprints are shed. What matters is that the material was left in the public domain. Applying this rationale, the Maryland Supreme Court concluded that the defendant abandoned any privacy interest he had in his shed DNA collected from a chair in which he had been sitting. In doing so, the court rejected the notion that abandonment required an explicitly voluntarily knowing act, noting the fact that one has not knowingly exposed to the public certain evidence does not by itself demonstrate a reasonable expectation of privacy in that evidence. While Katz says it is no search to discover what one knowingly exposes, it does not declare the exact reverse of this proposition. That is, the Supreme Court did not say that the discovery of what was not knowingly exposed is inevitably a search. Well, that's confusing, but anyway, moving on. Likewise here, at some point, defendant apparently interacted with the sheath to a sufficient enough degree that he left his DNA thereon. Whether he left his DNA behind is of no consequence, or whether he knew he'd left behind his DNA is no consequence. It is only relevant that he exposed his DNA to the public by leaving it on the sheath, therefore forfeiting any reasonable expectation of privacy in the DNA left behind. All right. Number 2. Even if not abandoned, defendant has not established his subjective privacy interest in his DNA. It is objectively reasonable that Fourth Amendment search occurs when the government seeks to gain information by infringing upon someone's reasonable expectation of privacy. Katz versus United States. An expectation of privacy is objectively reasonable when it's legitimate, justifiable, and one society should both recognize and protect. It is true that DNA testing, particularly SNP testing, can unlock a wealth of intensely private information about an individual, including family relationships, ancestry, genetic disorders, and the propensity for health-related risks. Okay, such highly private information is already protected under the law and in other contexts, including in Idaho, through the Genetic Testing Privacy Act, which prohibits genetic discrimination in employment. Given the privacy interests implicated by DNA testing, defendant argues that DNA, even lawfully in possession of law enforcement, cannot be tested absent probable cause and a warrant. Okay, so, all right. Well, they did have probable cause, but they didn't need a warrant. In defendant's view, the breadth of information SNP testing can reveal is analogous to the CSLI issue at Carpenter, so regarding phone searches, where the United States Supreme Court held a person maintains a legitimate expectation of privacy in the record of his physical movements as captured through CSLI, data maintained by a person's wireless carrier. In Carpenter, court reasoned that those detailed encyclopedic records, which provided an all-encompassing record of the defendant's location over a course of 127 consecutive days. My God, can you imagine how detailed that was? Like tracking your phone for 127 days. Can give law enforcement an intimate window into a person's life, revealing not only his particular movements, but through them his familial, political, professional, religious, and sexual associations. Wow, I hope not all at once, but who knows? All right, these location records hold for many Americans the privacies of life. Defendant also relies on Riley, where the United States Supreme Court held that police may not search digital information from a cell phone seized pursuant to a search incident to arrest exception to a warrant requirement. The court observed that, unlike physical objects, digital data on a cell phone does not implicate the same government interest justifying searches incident to arrest. I.e. preventing loss of evidence and threats to officer safety. Further, the court found that the extent of personal information digital data would reveal about a person implicated significant privacy interests, noting that while an arrestee has diminished privacy interests, it does not mean the arrestee has no Fourth Amendment protections. By analogy to Riley, defendant contends that law enforcement should be required to obtain a search warrant to analyze DNA from the sheath, despite being in lawful possession thereof. So we can take it from the crime scene, but you need a warrant to test the DNA. No, you don't. Sorry, no, you don't. You can take any object from a crime scene and analyze it in any way you like. Sorry, no. In regards to the SNP testing of DNA in particular, defendant relies on Skinner versus Railway Labor Executives Association, where the United States Supreme Court held that the collection and subsequent testing of an employee's legally obtained urine constitutes a Fourth Amendment search. The court observed that while a physical intrusion into an employee's body a physical intrusion into an employee's body to collect the urine is an obvious infringement, I don't think so, of an employee's reasonable expectation of privacy. The subsequent chemical analysis of the urine sample to obtain physiological data about the employee is a further invasion of the employee's privacy interest, given that such testing can reveal a host of private medical facts about an employee, including whether or not she is epileptic, pregnant, or diabetic. Well, I think the intrusion into the employee's body to collect the urine, I think that trumps everything, honestly. How can you do that? How can you do that? Dear God. Based on Carpenter, Riley, and Skinner, defendant contends that because SNP testing of DNA is even more revealing than phone data or urine testing, it should be allowed only with a warrant, regardless of whether the DNA is lawfully obtained. Nope. Defendant argues that this is precisely what the Fourth Circuit did in United States versus Davis, where it held that the extraction of DNA and the creation of a DNA profile results in a sufficiently separate invasion of privacy, as such acts must be considered a separate search under the Fourth Amendment, even when there is no issue concerning the collection of the DNA sample. The issue in Davis was DNA extracted from the defendant's clothing, which had been lawfully seized 4 years earlier when the defendant was a crime victim in an unrelated case. Interesting. Relying on Skinner, the court reasoned that the extraction and analysis was a search because the analysis of biological samples, such as those derived from blood, urine, and other bodily fluids can reveal physiological data and a host of private medical facts such analysis may intrude upon. Expectations of privacy that society has long recognized as reasonable. However, these cases lend no support to defendant when applied to the specific circumstances presented here for 3 reasons. 1, there is no reasonable expectation of privacy and identity. You've left your DNA at a crime scene. End of. Defendant has not shown his DNA was tested for anything other than identifying purposes. So, it's not like the employee situation where they're trying to find out whatever they're trying to find out. It's not the same as that. And 3, even if the DNA analysis revealed sensitive personal information, there is no reasonable expectation of privacy in crime scene DNA. All right, so there's more details there of cases, which I'm not going to read. I'm like clutching at straws here. All right, first, there is no reasonable expectation of privacy in our identifying characteristics such as fingerprints. This is because the analysis of such physical characteristics involves none of the probing into an individual's private life and thought that marks. Look, it's not the same as intrusively taking urine from somebody's body. It's totally not the same. Testing somebody's fingerprints left on a table is absolutely not the same as intrusively collecting urine from somebody's body. Likewise, it's not the same as collecting DNA off a knife sheath found at a crime scene. Not the same. Good try, but not the same. Okay. And also not the same as phone searches. Also not the same as that. All right, on the basis, courts have held that testing of DNA for identification purposes does not run afoul of the Fourth Amendment because it is no more revealing than fingerprints. Where DNA testing is not obtained by means of physical intrusion into a person's body, it is no more a search for purposes of the Fourth Amendment than for testing of fingerprints or the observation of any other identifying features revealed in the public, visage, apparent age, body type, skin color, etc. Lightning DNA analysis used for identification purposes to analyzing latent fingerprints. The Idaho Court of Appeals has all but followed suit. In Piro versus State, a post-conviction action, the Court of Appeals addressed whether the petitioner's counsel was deficient in failing to argue his client had a reasonable expectation of privacy in his genetic information left behind on a water bottle. In rejecting the claim, the court first noted that since the issue of genetic privacy in DNA was a novel theory in an undeveloped area of law, counsel was not ineffective in failing to raise it. Moreover, the court cast doubt of the substantive value of the argument, noting that in other jurisdictions, court have held that the use of DNA for identification purposes only does not infringe on privacy interest in one genetic's identity because DNA is not being used to reveal personal information. Good stuff. Second, in Maryland versus King, decided after Skinner, Riley, and Davis, the United States Supreme Court confirmed that the objective reasonableness of a privacy interest in DNA depends on how the DNA is actually used by the government, not what it's capable of revealing. At issue in King was a Maryland statute which permitted the warrantless acquisition of a buccal swab from an arrestee to obtain DNA sample. Because the testing was for identification purposes, which is constitutionally permissible, and did not reveal genetic trait or private medical information, the court found it did not contravene an arrestee's privacy in any way. Notably, the DNA testing in King was of the SDR alleles, which, unlike SNP testing, are not known to have any association with genetic disease or other genetic predispositions. However, the court signalled that it is how the DNA is tested that is legally relevant, not what it is capable of revealing. To wit, I love that. To wit. It's like an owl. To wit, to wit. And even if non-coding alleles could provide some information, they are not, in fact, tested for that end. It is undisputed that law enforcement officers analyze DNA for the sole purpose of generating a unique identifying number against any which future samples may be matched. This parallels a similar safeguard based upon actual practice in the school drug testing context, where the court deemed it significant that the test at issue look only for drugs and not for whether the student is, for example, epileptic, pregnant, or diabetic. If in the future police analyze samples to determine, for instance, an arrestee's predisposition for a particular disease or other hereditary factors not relevant to identity, this case would present additional privacy concerns not present here. Thus, under King, testing of lawfully obtained DNA samples may run afoul of the Fourth Amendment only if law enforcement uses it for purposes irrelevant to identification. Otherwise, it is more a search for Fourth Amendment purposes than the testing of fingerprint, or no more a search for Fourth Amendment purposes than testing of fingerprints. Noting that if law enforcement had tested the defendant's DNA to reveal physiology and health conditions, such as a genetic predisposition to cancer, it might implicate privacy interests, but law enforcement did not do so. DNA could have disclosed more intimate information, is of no other purpose in the present case because there is no allegation that the police tested his DNA sample for that purpose. Oh, Ann Taylor's busy writing the next motion saying, yes, they tested for his health stuff. They tested all of that. Well, prove it then, Anne. Prove it. While DNA is potentially revealing a vast amount of personal information, no privacy interest was implicated where the testing of DNA was limited to identification, as we keep saying. Here, defendant provided no evidence that the SNP profile developed from Q1.1 through IgG revealed any genetic predispositions or physiological or medical conditions. As Mr. Hellwig testified, the SNPs that carry such sensitive information are not targeted or revealed in IgG because they are neither relevant nor probative nor appropriate to the identification process, which is the goal of IgG. Rather, IgG only implicates those SNPs associated with ancestry and genealogy in order to determine genetic associations, build a family tree, and identify potential genetic relatives of the uploaded SNP profile. It is simply an identification tool. And Mr. Hellwig was a defense witness. I love it that the judge is using Mr. Hellwig to make his point. It is simply an identification tool. In this regard, Carpenter is unavailing authority and has been found by other courts addressing the issue of privacy interests in DNA generally. The CLSI in Carpenter was not used as an identification tool. It was used as a comprehensive surveillance tool after the suspect had already been identified. At best, Carpenter can be applied to technologies that provide the government with comprehensive surveillance of known persons' physical movements. It is not the type of information the DNA provides in this case. So no, can't use that argument either. Law enforcement here extracted and analysed the DNA of an unknown suspect solely for identification purposes. It provided no information as to the location of a known person, does not begin to approach the surveillance described in Carpenter. Riley is distinguishable as well as it was context-driven, focusing on the lack of connection between the justifications underpinning the search incident to arrest exception to the warrant requirement and the search of digital data of a cell phone. The court noted that after an arrestee's cell phone secured by officers, digital data it contains cannot harm the officer or be destroyed. Thus, a search of the digital data becomes solely a fishing expedition without justification. Here, by contrast, law enforcement analysed the DNA from a crime scene item associated with a weapon for purposes of identifying the perpetrator. Identification is an accepted justification for testing DNA. Thus, Riley is unavailing. Moreover, even assuming there were sensitive genetic details revealed by the IgG performed here, the fact that the DNA was obtained from a crime scene and analysed for purposes of identifying the perpetrator displaces any reasonable expectation of privacy. Exactly. That's what it boils down to. It's gotten from a crime scene. The Court of Appeals of Washington recently came to the same conclusion under similar facts. In State versus Hartman, law enforcement extracted DNA from semen and hair left on a murder victim's body. The DNA was then sent to a... What's these? Okay. All right. Sent to a genealogy consultant who uploaded a genetic profile to various genealogical databases for analysis. From that analysis, law enforcement learned that the suspect had alleles related to substance abuse, bipolar disorder, and baldness, and was approximately 9% Native American. The genealogist used the information obtained from the databases and other resources to build a family tree, from which she learned that there was an instance of misattributed paternity in the subject's family. Wow, this is personal information. Her research ultimately pointed law enforcement towards the defendant. Like here, the defendant in Hartman argued he had reasonable privacy interests in the DNA extracted from the semen, which law enforcement violated through its analysing, revealing private personal details. In declining to recognise his privacy interest as reasonable, the court observed it was a well-established rule that analysis of evidence left behind at a crime scene does not require a warrant where the abandoned evidence contains DNA, even though DNA contained a wealth of personal information. I don't know why the genetic consultant had to know all of those things, though, honestly. That seems problematic to me, regardless of whether it came from a crime scene or not. That seems problematic to me. All right. Okay. The court observed that the DNA was not only abandoned, the analysis performed by law enforcement was to determine the killer's identity and nothing more. What, that he was predisposed to bipolar, substance abuse, and baldness? I don't think that's for identification purposes, honestly. I don't think you can say that when you go that far into your SNP profile. Thus, even though the analysis revealed personal details, they were identifying characteristics that served to narrow the suspect pool and therefore did not run afoul of the Fourth Amendment. Oh, I've got a problem with that one. I do have a problem with that one. I totally do. All right, this holding highlights another important point, that the state of the individual whose DNA is tested helps frame the reasonableness of the privacy expectations. In Davis, relied upon heavily by the defendant, the Fourth Circuit's holding rested entirely on the fact that the DNA tested was taken from clothing police seized years earlier when the defendant was a crime victim. Noted, we agree with the district court that a person who is solely a crime victim does not lose all reasonable expectation of privacy in his or her DNA materials simply because it has come into lawful possession of the police. And although Davis later was arrested, because the police seized his clothing when he was solely a crime victim, we concluded that his later arrest does not eradicate his expectation of privacy in his DNA material. The fact that the district court affirmed in Davis drew a distinction between the analysis of crime scene DNA and other DNA, stating this finding would not, as the government argues, require the police to seek a warrant in order to analyse any items recovered from a crime scene for DNA evidence. No one would argue, for example, that a rapist retains a reasonable expectation of privacy in the DNA contained in his semen. Well, as we've seen above, some people are arguing exactly that. Society considered it reasonable that if one had committed a crime, any evidence one leaves behind while doing so is fair game. The intentional, volitional act of committing the crime itself supports a theory that the criminal intends to abandon any privacy interest in his blood, fluid, cells, etc., that he may leave behind at the crime scene. Furthermore, the very fact that a given area is a crime scene changes the balance of interests relevant to the Fourth Amendment analysis of crime scene evidence. Okay. All right. This distinction between crime scene DNA and other DNA likewise renders Skinner of no use to the defendant. In Skinner, the urine was collected from employees of the workplace and subjected to testing. It was not obtained to be tested for identification purposes. It was obtained to test whether the employees had drugs or alcohol in their systems. Had it been urine left by an unknown suspect at a crime scene and then tested to determine identity, the results would undoubtedly be different. Completely different circumstances. Whether using that one, it just doesn't make sense. Even legal commentators who advocate for increased protection over DNA evidence agree that the Fourth Amendment does not prevent law enforcement from analysing genetic evidence left at a crime scene. Okay. If the DNA was found on the victim, on a murder weapon, or another object closely related to the crime, that DNA may be analysed without implicating the Fourth Amendment. Okay. Observing that her proposal requiring a warrant to test all DNA samples discarded by crime suspects would not apply to DNA collected at crime scenes or in the testing of rape kits because there is no reasonable expectation of privacy in DNA deposited at the crime scene. Fourth Amendment, genetic privacy, requiring a warrant to test DNA recovered at crime scene would be pointless because there's nothing for a magistrate to consider. In sum, all right, so all long-winded, but in sum, defendant's arguments find no support under law. Any privacy interest he can claim in his DNA was abandoned along with the sheath, to which he claims no ownership or knowledge. Judge Hippler must have been sitting there thinking, come on now, Anne. Come on now, Anne. I'm gonna rule against you, but I'm gonna let you talk for 2 whole days. Bring as many witnesses as you like, because the cases that you're using, no, the arguments that you're making, no, and you can't say. This is the bottom line here. The bottom line is you can't say that a knife sheath left at a crime scene that you do not know, you've never seen it before. You've never seen it before. You've no knowledge of it. You weren't there. But then you say that the DNA that was on it is your DNA. So you deserve for that to be private, and they should have got a warrant before they tested that DNA. You can't have it both ways. You can't have it both ways. Sorry. By trying to apply this argumentation, I'm sorry, you are admitting that DNA is yours. That DNA was on the murder weapon next to Maddie's body. Therefore, you are admitting your DNA was left there. You were there. Sorry. No, sorry. In sum, right, no support under law. Any privacy interest he claims in his DNA was abandoned along with the sheath, to which he claims no ownership or knowledge. Even if no such abandonment occurred, defendant has not demonstrated it is reasonable to recognise the privacy interest in DNA left at a crime scene, particularly when it is analysed for identification purposes and nothing more. Further, to find that defendant retained a reasonable privacy interest in DNA left at a crime scene, indeed, on an item intimately associated with the suspected weapon, would have an untenable effect of eliminating the use of abandoned DNA as an investigative tool. As observed by the United States Supreme Court in King, this tool has utmost importance. Yeah, you can't set a precedent here. You can't say, oh, no, you needed a warrant for that. We're going to throw it all out. No, you just can't do that. It's too important. DNA is too important to solving of crime to allow Brian Kohberger to get away with it. Sorry. Since the first use of forensic DNA analysis to catch a rapist and murderer in England in 1986, law enforcement, the defence bar and the courts have acknowledged DNA testing Unparalleled ability. You see, it's not just about solving crimes, is it? DNA found at crime scenes left behind exonerates people as well. So again, you're setting a very dangerous precedent. If you want to start throwing DNA out of crime scenes because, you've got a privacy interest in it, even though you left it at a crime scene, you're setting a very, very dangerous bar there. Not just for, pinning the crime on a particular person, but also in exonerating people who may have been unfairly imprisoned. Years ago, before DNA testing, how many people have been exonerated? In recent years, when, technological advances have allowed DNA testing to be done, and you find that the DNA in the semen left at a crime scene is not the person who's in prison. So you can't throw DNA out for privacy concerns. It's too important. Sorry, Anne. Sorry, Brian. You just can't. All right. It has potential for significantly improve the criminal justice system and police investigation practices. Yeah, unparalleled ability to both exonerate long the convicted and identify the guilty. Thank you. Neither society nor this court are prepared to go where defendant seeks to take us. Thank you. Thank you, Judge Hippler, for that reason alone. He has made the right decision. Whether or not the FBI did shady shit, denied their own policy, and sent that DNA off to a service that didn't want you to, I'm sorry. This is too important to set a precedent to say, because the FBI used my heritage and my heritage, boo, 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 our users now will boo-hoo, that we expected you not to use it. Well, I'm sorry. There are some things that are more important. They haven't broken the law by doing that. If my heritage are upset, I'm sorry, my heritage are upset. I'm sorry about that. Deal with it. Find ways to prevent law enforcement from doing this. Because there's no law against it. So it's too important. This is too important. You can't set a precedent where you allow an argument where DNA lawfully collected at a crime scene is thrown out. And please don't let Kohberger out. He'll do it again. I promise you. If he's let out, he'll do it again. I promise you. He'll consider it a challenge and he'll do it right this time. I promise you. All you pro-burgers, I'm sorry. You let him out, he'll do it again. All right. Neither society nor this court are prepared to go. All right, we've read that. Therefore, because the developments of the SNP profile did not contravene defendants' Fourth Amendment rights, suppression is not warranted. Denied. It just means denied. All right. Defendant has not established a Fourth Amendment violation with regard to the trash pull and testing of DNA herefrom because it's not his trash. Judge Hippler could have written this in 2 sentences. You've not established a Fourth Amendment violation because it wasn't your trash and it wasn't your DNA on the trash. So why is Brian Kohberger complaining about it? If Michael Kohberger wants to complain about it, all right, let Michael Kohberger complain about it. But Brian Kohberger can't complain about it. It's not his trash, not his DNA. It was his dad's trash and his dad's property by his dad's trash collectors and his dad's DNA. Completely irrelevant. Judge Hippler could have just stopped writing there. I'm sorry. No. Bullshit. Absolute bullshit. Wasn't his DNA, it was his dad's. All right. Defendant next asserts that law enforcement's trash pull from his parents' Pennsylvania residence and subsequent DNA testing thereon constitutes warrantless and unreasonable searching, mandating suppression. He argues he has reasonable expectation of privacy in his parents' garbage. I'm sorry. A grown man does not have any sway whatsoever in what his parents do with their garbage or what anybody else does with their parents' garbage. I'm sorry. No, denied. I honestly, Judge Hippler has got a lot of patience and to write this, because he must have been laughing when he wrote that sentence. He must have been laughing his head off. Like, why does Brian Kohberger doesn't live in that house, lives like right over the other side of the freaking country? Why does he have, like, feel that his Fourth Amendment has been violated because the FBI took his parents' garbage? It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Ridiculous. The privacy interest, according to defendant, is predicated not only on Monroe County's municipal ordinance prohibiting anyone other than a garbage collector from collecting the Kohberger family's curbside trash, but also from the fact that Kohbergers resided in a gated neighborhood and the garbage cans were on the driveway as opposed to a public area. The defendant provides no evidence that the garbage cans were on the driveway as opposed to on the street. So you can't even say that. You can't even say that. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You have put your trash cans out for garbage pickup. Therefore, that trash is constitutionally abandoned. I'm sorry, it is. All right. It is in my country, just as it is in the United States. Okay. Don't throw your crime scene stuff away in your bin and complain while the cops are watching you. They go to the bin collector and say, oh, can we just have a look at that? Can we just take that? Because they'll say, yeah, take it. You can't do that. And it's not even, it's like me saying, oh, right, okay, my mother's committed a crime. All right. And then they come and search my bins. And then my mother complains about it. Well, I'm sorry, I'm not going to defend my mother by trying to protect my bins. And my mother can't say that my bins are a problem if she's got caught by... No, it just doesn't make sense. It's nonsensical. Nonsensical. Ridiculous. Anyhow, while defendant acknowledges binding precedent holds otherwise, of course it does. Warrantless seizure and search of garbage did not violate Fourth Amendment rights, blah, blah, blah. He asserts it is time to rethink these decisions. All right, so they want to completely rewrite the law. So they say, oh, the law's not in our favour, right? Well-established law, not in our favour. We admit that, but we want to rethink. We want to rethink the entire law because Brian Kohberger is upset that the FBI went and found some DNA in his parents' trash. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. And find a reasonable expectation that privacy exists, if not under the Fourth Amendment, but then under an increased protection afforded by Article 117 of the Idaho Constitution. Alternately, he argues that even if the trash pull was lawful, well, look, how can the Idaho Constitution have any sway on this? How? Because the trash pull was in Pennsylvania, not in Idaho. So, no. And you didn't live in Idaho either. I know the crime was committed in Idaho, but the Kohbergers lived in Pennsylvania. Brian lived in Washington. So you can't say that the Idaho Constitution has got any relevance whatsoever to anything. The trash was pulled from Pennsylvania. Dear God, dear me. Oh my. Oh my. Oh my. Alternatively, right, he's going to try another way. He argues that even if the trash pull was lawful, the testing of the DNA found on the items of trash was not under Skinner and Davis. No, we've already argued at Skinner and Davis. We don't need to go back to Skinner and Davis. We've argued they're not relevant to DNA in your circumstance. So DNA on a trash item that is not even your DNA. You're arguing about his dad's DNA. Right, there's nothing that's relevant to you, Brian. It's Michael Kohberger's DNA, not yours. So if there's a privacy concern to be had, it's by Michael Kohberger, not by Brian Christopher Kohberger. I'm sorry. However, after defendant filed his motion, the Idaho Supreme Court reaffirmed its holding in Donato and rejected the very argument asserted by defendant here, that a local waste management ordinance, can we not just say whatever Idaho say is irrelevant because this comes from Pennsylvania? You gotta look at Pennsylvanian law, but no. Can we not just say that? No, all right, we're sticking with Idaho, that's fine. All right, a local waste management ordinance can create a reasonable expectation of privacy. An objective expectation of privacy is not created simply because an ordinance aimed to maintain society's interest in sanitation dictates how trash is to be collected. As for the subsequent DNA testing of discarded items, relevant here is the abandonment theory. This court is bound by the decision of the Idaho Supreme Court. It actually isn't, because the trash was collected in Pennsylvania. However, I said I was going to go with it, so we're going to go with it. There are no facts presented here that meaningfully distinguish this case from Donato or Paluzzi. That the garbage cans may have been placed in the Kohberger's driveway for collection as opposed to on the public road, and that the Kohberger's neighborhood was gated, are legally irrelevant factors given that the garbage was placed for the purpose of having it collected by another. Thank you. You put your garbage in your bin and you discarded it. It's abandoned. You can go and rifle through people's bins if you want. You might get done for trespassing on their property, but if you can lean over the fence and put your hand in their bin and you get some really good, stuff from it, they can't argue. They can't. They've abandoned it. All right. Okay. I've got stuff out of people's bins before. All right. Okay. People throw really, really good stuff away. People throw good stuff away. If it's there and I see it, I'm gonna say, I'm gonna have that. I've had plant pots. I've got like storage containers. Good stuff. All right. Okay, where were we? Don't like it when he splits it all up in brackets. It's hard to read. So finding no reasonable expectation of privacy in garbage placed outside. Okay, we know that. Privacy interest in trash is lost when it is deposited in an area particularly suited for public inspection, public consumption, for the express purposes of having strangers take it. Therefore, the trash pull did not contravene the defendant's Fourth Amendment rights. Okay, got more law there. Moreover, as already discussed, it is well settled that one abandons a privacy interest in one's DNA by discarding an item containing the DNA. By throwing away an item of trash containing his DNA, defendant cannot object to the testing of that DNA. It wasn't his DNA, though. It wasn't his DNA. It was his dad's DNA. The defendant cannot object to the testing of that DNA, particularly given that it was standard DNA testing. Consequently, no suppression is warranted in respect to the trash pull. Defendant also lacks stand. There we go. Why have you got that in a footnote? That should be in bold. That's the main point here. That should be in bold right at the beginning. That should be the point. The point. Defendant also lacks standing to object to testing his father's DNA, as it's not his own. However, even if he had standing as to his father's DNA, the fact that the item carrying the DNA was voluntarily placed in the trash for collection, it results in abandonment. Should have said that from the beginning and then ended it. Not his DNA. Not his DNA. Not his problem, except it was. Anyhow, defendant cannot establish the search of the genetic genealogy databases implicated his Fourth Amendment rights. All right, this is the bit that I've got the most issue with. This is the shady shit. This is the shady bit. DNA at a crime scene is fair game. All right, but how they arrived at that SNP profile, all right, we've talked about it already, but let's see what Judge Hippler says about it. Defendant cannot establish the search of the genetic genealogy databases implicated his Fourth Amendment rights. Defendant's final argument, final desperation, which probably has the most legs, but then again it doesn't, is that law enforcement's warrantless search of the commercial genetic genealogy databases violated his rights to privacy and his relatives' genetic information, or in his relatives' genetic information. No. No. The fact that you are searching a genealogy database and there's loads of people listed in it, some of whom, most of whom are probably dead, like long dead, like people, you can do whatever you want with that information. You can do whatever you want with that information. That's publicly available information. You've got no right to privacy because somebody happens to be your ancestor, or who happens to be a second cousin twice removed, and you share a great-great-grandfather. You have no right to say what happens to that information. Sorry, no. All right. Observing that this issue has not been addressed by the United States Supreme Court or Idaho's Appellate Court. It's new. It's new in Idaho. He asked this court to recognize as a matter of first impression that he has a reasonable expectation of privacy in the genetics he shares with his relatives, and further find that such privacy was not undermined when his relatives uploaded their genetic information to a commercial genetic genealogy database. Alternatively, he claims that the FBI search of MyHeritage and GEDmatch was lawful because those databases were off limits or unlawful. Okay. Alternatively, he claims that the FBI search of MyHeritage and GEDmatch was unlawful because those databases were off limits to law enforcement, both under the interim policy and those databases' own terms. Questionable, but not unlawful. Not unlawful. Morally questionable, yes. Yes. A slippery slope, yes, but not unlawful. And as I said before, the main issue really here is for those companies. And what ways are they going to prevent law enforcement from using those services in the future if they are going to continue to claim to their customers that law enforcement doesn't use their services? They know full well that law enforcement can just log in on any random profile and upload crime scene DNA. They know that. They absolutely know that. If they continue to say to their customers that they don't, then I'm sorry, they're the problem. They're the problem. The state responds that defendant has failed to demonstrate a reasonable expectation of privacy, either in any of the commercial genetic genealogy databases or his relatives' DNA. Even if defendant could assert a privacy interest in the latter, the state contends that such interest was lost when such relatives shared that DNA with the public by uploading it to a database. Moreover, it argues that any violation by law enforcement of the terms of service of these databases or in its own internal policy does not implicate the Fourth Amendment. Doesn't. It absolutely doesn't. It's a policy issue. But it's you can be a company and have any policy you want. It does not change the law. I'm sorry, it does not change the law. If someone comes along and infringes your policy, then what can you do? Ban them. You can ban them from your website. You could probably try to sue them if you felt that it damaged your reputation or your future earnings. I think that's probably why Othram won't do it, is because they're scared of being sued. They're scared of being sued by MyHeritage, with MyHeritage claiming that they know full well this is the policy, and by breaking this policy, it could potentially damage our sales in future, and our reputation. So that's why Othram won't do it. But the FBI, what are they going to do? Yeah, they could try it. They could try to sue the FBI. Maybe that's what they should do. But it's not unlawful. It's not unlawful. Okay. The court has already determined that defendant failed to show a legitimate privacy interest to challenge the development of the SNP profile from Q1.1. If defendant does not have a reasonable expectation of privacy in the SNP profile, there is no basis to find an expectation of privacy in those portions of his SNP profile he shares with genetic relatives. Exactly. However, to the extent, look, right, I could open up Ancestry right now and show you my genetic relatives. I could show you that this person is my second cousin and I have no idea who they are. I could show you where they live if they filled in their profile. And they can't do anything. They can't do anything. They can't, because they've added it to a public database. Do they have an expectation of privacy? In the name, maybe. But in their relationship to me, no. No, because they've chosen to add their DNA to that database, and they've chosen for genetic matches to, show on in public. So they've made those choices. So no, I'm sorry, you can't make that argument. You can't. However, to the extent the court's prior conclusion does not dispose of this issue, defendant's assertions lack merit because defendant has not shown a reasonable expectation in privacy in any of the commercial genealogical databases or in his relatives' DNA. Defendant also lacks standing to object. Oh, that's what we've done before. And 2, any alleged violation by law enforcement of its own policies and thus of the databases is not of constitutional importance. Thank you. Defendant cannot demonstrate a reasonable expectation of privacy in common segments of DNA a relative as uploaded to the public sphere. To invoke the exclusionary rule to suppress evidence under the Fourth Amendment, a defendant must establish that his own personal rights were violated by an unlawful search. Fourth Amendment rights are personal rights, which, like some other constitutional rights, may not be vicariously asserted. Exactly, that's why he can't claim that them testing his dad's DNA and complaining that his constitutional rights have been infringed. He can't. Neither can he say that because they found out who his third cousins were, that he's had constitutional rights violated. No. Go away, Brian. Go and sit down. Sit down, Anne. Sit down, you're drunk. All right. Defendant acknowledges that the search challenges that... Oh, God, I'm going. My brain's going. We're nearly at the end. We're nearly there. All right. Defendant acknowledges that the search challenged is that of his relatives' uploaded DNA and not his own. To get around this hurdle, he claims a reasonable expectation of privacy in the segments of shared DNA. No. His relatives uploaded to the database. No. A second cousin, right? You average. Second cousin, I think you will share about maybe 4% of your DNA on average with the second cousin. But in those segments, we've got to throw out the entire case because he shares 4% of shared DNA with his second cousin. Come on now. All right. I think it's 4%. It might be a bit more, but come on now. All right. 2, that such privacy interest persisted despite other individuals sharing his or her genetic makeup with the public at large. Dear me. You're going to patent your DNA. Oh, dear. Dear. Yeah, Michael Kohberger only had one son. Oh, imagine the Ferrari. Imagine what the media would have done. They probably would never have found out, though. Imagine if Michael Kohberger believed that Brian was his biological child, and then the testing by the FBI revealed that he wasn't. That would have been funny. All right. We'd never have known that one. The FBI would never have made to that, would they? All right. Okay. The court will not make this leap, and rightfully so. This is why, this is the heart of the matter here. This is why Judge Hippler, I know a lot of people disagree, but Judge Hippler has made the right decision here. Yes, it's shady that they infringed their own policy, but at the end of the day, they did nothing wrong, nothing illegal. And private companies' policies, even the FBI's own internal policies, they don't trump the law and they don't trump the Constitution. So there's that. First, there's no authority for defendant's position. Granted, given the novelty of using commercial genomic platforms as an investigative tool, there are a few cases addressing it. However, not one has found that a defendant has reasonable privacy interests in a relative shared DNA. The primary case cited by both parties is Hartman, where the State of Washington Court of Appeals rejected the defendant's contention that he has a privacy interest in those segments of his DNA he shares with relatives that was violated when law enforcement searched commercial genealogy databases to find a familial match to crime scene DNA. Like here, the defendant likened DNA to the phone stuff at issue in Carpenter and urged the court to follow Carpenter to find that his relatives' voluntary upload of their shared DNA did not forfeit his expectation of privacy and blah, blah, blah. The court's determination that the defendant lacked a reasonable privacy interest in segments of shared DNA rested upon multiple grounds. The court first observed that the sole purpose of a genealogical database is to let others search for and share private information about the user's personal and family history for the purposes of finding relatives. To this end, the court found shared DNA is unlike the phone stuff in Carpenter, which was not shared for the purpose of public perusal. The court further noted that the comparison of the DNA obtained from the crime scene to the genetic profiles of the defendant's relatives was limited to the identification purposes and therefore did not support any privacy interest. In addition, the court found no historical protection for voluntary shared genetic information or for information posted on websites intended for public access. Consequently, the court concluded that because law enforcement's investigation of the genealogy databases did not disturb a reasonable privacy interest, the defendant had no standing to challenge the search. Other courts addressing the issue have held similarly. State versus Western, finding no reasonable expectation of privacy in genetic identifying information voluntarily uploaded to genealogy databases. People versus Williams, finding the defendant lacked standing to suppress evidence obtained through investigative genealogy search because Williams cannot assert a personal privacy interest in his relative's DNA. United States versus Mitchell, in responding to the defendant's arguments that collection of his DNA upon arrest was improper because, inter alia, it could be used to investigate biological relationships between individuals, court observed that he had no standing to assert the Fourth Amendment of his relatives. Other than claiming that the Hartman court failed to appreciate its holding, defendant has not offered any basis or even a reasonable analogue from which the court could make the unprecedented finding that he has personal privacy interest in someone else's DNA. No, it's just crazy. It's insane. It's insane. They're dreaming. They're dreaming if you thought that any judge would go with this. It's dream world stuff. While he may share segments of this DNA, it's not his DNA that was searched in the genetic databases. Further, there is no evidence he took efforts to shield his genetic relatives' DNA from the public view. No, he's not written to all of his relatives, has he, saying, I'm offended at the fact that I share 4% of your DNA. Listen, you don't know who the majority of your relatives are when you look at things. You've no idea who your relatives are. How do you know the person down the road shares DNA with you? Ridiculous. Oh, don't put your finger down there. You're leaving touch DNA, and I might share 1% of DNA with you. So don't leave your touch DNA there. I've got a right to privacy over 1% of your genome. Come on now. We need some sensible heads here. And Judge Hippler has got a very sensible head on his shoulders. Not putting up with this shit. All right. And by the way, even if I thought that Brian Kohberger was factually innocent, I could not agree. I could not agree with the defense's argument here. It's silly. It's really silly. You don't have rights over someone else's DNA. Dear me. All right. Thus, since you cannot establish a personal expectation of privacy in the item searched, you cannot challenge the search. Moreover, any subjective privacy interest he claims in his relative's DNA is not reasonable. One cannot have a reasonable expectation of privacy in what is knowingly exposed to public view. Notably, genealogy database searched by law enforcement normally allowed law enforcement access, whereas here the databases purportedly did not. However, as explained below, this does not alter the result. Even information exposed to just a single person results in forfeiture of a reasonable privacy interest under third-party doctrine. It absolutely does indeed. Third-party doctrine is derived from a pair of cases from the 1970s where the United States Supreme Court carved out from the reasonable expectation of privacy standard information that an individual shares with a third party from whom law enforcement subsequently obtains this information. Exactly. Someone else tells you something. They're allowed to use that. No expectation of privacy in records of dialed telephone numbers. Blah, blah, blah. All right, cool. All right, here, defendants' relatives did not voluntarily share their genetic information with just a single entity. They voluntarily shared it with hundreds of thousands of other participants. Exactly. That's why people should be thinking about whether or not they want to give their genetic information to these private companies. That it's your choice. You're voluntarily doing it, and there's lots of consequences for it. One of which is the private company that you agreed to their terms of service and blah blah blah, and the the conditions of how they're going to use your DNA. They're a private company. They can change that at any time, and the best you can do is to delete your profile. So think about it. They can change their terms. They could allow law enforcement to use their services. Even if they don't today, they could tomorrow. So if you're saying, oh, I'm using this company because they never let law enforcement use their databases, well, that's nonsense, because tomorrow they might, and you have absolutely no say in it. They've got a right to change their terms of service. You've got a right to delete your profile, but that's all. And if the FBI come along and use MyHeritage or another site that says we do not allow law enforcement to use, our customers' DNA, well, I'm sorry, they know that law enforcement are, and there's nothing they can do about it. So they have a vested interest in making people believe that, but they need to work harder to prevent law enforcement from doing it. I'm sorry, because it's not against the law. It might be against, best practice, but yeah, the real world, it's not all about best practice, is it? It's about catching people who leave DNA on knife sheaths at crime scenes where 4 university students were murdered. That's what we're up against here. Do we infringe on MyHeritage's policy? Do we say, oh, we can't do it because MyHeritage says no? Or do we catch a quadruple murderer? Which one? Which one is it? Which one's better? All right. Consumers frequently upload their DNA to consumer databases like GEDmatch for the very purpose of learning and sharing with strangers the exact private information, details about their ancestry and familial relations at issue here. Consequently, defendant cannot claim any subjective expectation of privacy he had was reasonable. Absolutely. Defendant warns that applying the third-party doctrine mechanically to DNA would have deleterious results. He points out that DNA can reveal a vast array of private details about a person. Further, he argues it's not truly shared. He notes that when one individual provides DNA to a consumer genomic platform, the identities of hundreds of genomic relatives can be revealed through shared DNA sequences. Yes, that's the idea. That's the idea of these websites. Finally, he observes that while Idaho law protects genetic privacy in some circumstances, there is no comparable limits over law enforcement's use of DNA taken from a crime scene. Noting that DNA can be left everywhere and last in the environment for a long time, he warns that the entire population could find themselves the targets of police investigation absent some controls. Well, there are some controls, but not about testing DNA at a crime scene. That's fair game. Dear God. Despite defendants' dystopian warnings, the court does not find a departure from settled Fourth Amendment principles. In Carpenter, the United States Supreme Court observed that the application of the third-party doctrine does not turn solely on the act of sharing. Other factors make to consider are the nature of the information sought and any limitations on the revealing nature of the information. Doing so, the court declined to apply the third-party doctrine to phone data obtained from the defendant's cellular carrier. First, the court noted that the phone data is not truly shared. It logs a cell site record by virtue of its operation. I've read that. Without any affirming act on the user's blah, 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 blah. All right, the shared portion of DNA defendants' relatives uploaded to genetic databases do not merit this same treatment. While the court agrees that DNA can be revealing like phone data, such DNA was affirmatively shared in this case, unlike phone data. Dear God. All right. Defendants' relatives did not simply reveal the information as a byproduct of the participating in modern society. They engaged in such an affirmative act of uploading their DNA to public databases for the very purpose of sharing it with others. Just because Brian Kohberger doesn't like it because he got caught through it is irrelevant. Consequently, the reasoning in Carpenter does not apply. Moreover, any suggestion that defendants' relatives preserve their expectation of privacy against law enforcement by sharing genetic information on databases that exclude law enforcement is also unavailing. First, consent or non-consent to a search goes to the reasonableness of the search, not whether a privacy interest is objectively reasonable. State versus Maxim. 2019. Second, as discussed, a privacy interest can be lost by sharing information with even a single entity under the third-party doctrine. Even though the relatives may not have consented to law enforcement searching their genetic information, it was nevertheless shared with other members of the public. Exactly. So it's okay for other people to use it, but not for law enforcement. That doesn't make sense, does it? No. Okay. This is why these policies that MyHeritage and GEDmatch and others have promising their customers that law enforcement don't use their database are dead wrong. Are dead wrong. You add your DNA to any DNA database, any website at all, you have no privacy over how that DNA is used in the future. You have none. So think about that before you add your DNA to them. Listen, I have, because I don't have a problem with it. I don't have a problem with law enforcement using it. I don't have a problem with it. Please do go and catch my family members if they've committed crimes. Please do. However, if you're thinking that, oh, I use that website and they don't let law enforcement use it, it's nonsense. Absolutely nonsense. This is why these companies need to stop saying it. Okay. I'm glad Judge Hippler agrees with that argument. Can't say, oh, I've only uploaded it to this public database because I want to find my relatives, but then argue that other people are using it for other reasons. No, it doesn't work like that. Sorry. Even though the relatives may not have consented to law enforcement searching their genetic information, it was nevertheless shared with other members of the public, which is all that is required to remove any Fourth Amendment protections. Information that is knowingly exposed to the public, even in his own home or office, is not subject to law enforcement to Fourth Amendment protection. In sum, even if defendant could vicariously assert constitutional rights of others, a dubious claim at best, or no claim at all, I would have said, he has not shown that any subjective privacy right he may have had in his relative's shared DNA was reasonable. Therefore, defendant lacks standing to challenge law enforcement's search of the genetic genealogy databases. Also, no basis, we're nearly done, no basis of challenging law enforcement's alleged violation of its own policies and those of genealogy databases in conducting the search. Defendant next argues that even if the court were to find shared DNA falls within the traditional Fourth Amendment rules, as it has, law enforcement's alleged search of databases in violation of both databases terms and the interim policy cries out for judicial intervention. Defendant has provided no authority that these alleged violations of policy or user agreements bear on the Fourth Amendment. None. Again, because defendant has not demonstrated a reasonable privacy interest in his relative's DNA, defendant has no basis to challenge the propriety of the search. Second, even if he could establish a reasonable privacy interest, these alleged violations are of no significance. With regard to the violation of the database user policies, while this may give rise to a civil action between the FBI and the particular database, exactly, this is what I've been saying. Or perhaps the individuals whose DNA profiles were used, defendant has not explained how this implicates the Fourth Amendment. At best, MyHeritage can go and sue the FBI. At best. Good luck with that, but they could try. They may get somewhere. Or they may just change what they say on their website, lying to their customers. They all do it. Allegedly, in my opinion, before I get sued by MyHeritage. All right. At least one state district court has found it does not. See State versus Westrum. Law enforcement's possible violation of MyHeritage service agreement may subject them to action from MyHeritage, but the court does not see any reason why this violation of a private company's terms would implicate its constitutional protections. With regard to the FBI's alleged violation of its own policies or guidelines, the state correctly points out that the non-compliance with the law enforcement policy does not provide a basis for a Fourth Amendment challenge. Exactly. Like some little policy they have, of best practice, doesn't change the law, and it certainly doesn't change any constitution of any country. They're not that important. Police enforcement practices, even if they could be practically assessed by a judge, vary from place to place from time to time. We cannot accept that a search and seizure protection of the Fourth Amendment is so variable. Exactly. In addition, the interim policy of issue, as it expressly states, is intended to provide internal guidance only and does not create any substantive or procedural rights or benefits or impose any legal limitations or otherwise lawful investigative techniques, exactly as I've been saying, as I said like 3 hours ago. Therefore, violation of its terms cannot alone give rise to Fourth Amendment challenges, whereas the court has already found, and it also posits law enforcement violated Israeli law. Oh my God. Well, one. Right, okay, one. Brian Kohberger doesn't live in Israel. The crime wasn't committed in Israel. His parents don't live in Israel. I don't know whether any of his distant ancestors live in Israel. If they do, what? Okay, let's read this paragraph. When it searched MyHeritage, which is located in Israel. might have an office in Israel. It doesn't matter where its servers are located. I'm sorry. MyHeritage's private policies do not infringe on Israeli law. Oh, they don't. Oh, man. Oh, dear. Oh, dear. That is so sad. He claims that Israel's genetic information law prohibits law enforcement uses and does not provide a site to... He doesn't explain how this court is bound by Israeli law. Come on now. Take that up with Israel. All right? You want to take that up with Israel? Be my guest. You can be writing to the Israeli government, from his cell. Hi, I'm defendant Brian Christopher Kohberger. I'm currently sitting in Ada County Jail awaiting trial for quadruple murder. I would just like to report that a website purportedly that sits in your country might be infringing on your laws because I'm upset that I got caught via my DNA. Oh dear, I've heard everything now. I've heard it all. Oh man, oh dear. We're nearly at the end. I can breathe now. We're nearly at the end. The Israelis have entered the chat. Well, I don't know. What about China? Are China upset? Because the chances are that the computer that people are using to do these DNA searches, they're probably made in China. So let's get the Chinese involved also. I don't know. Come on now. This is silly. I don't think the Israelis care what Brian Kohberger's up to. They've got other fish to fry. Come on now. All right. I need a copy of Brian Kohberger's letter to the Israeli government, though. Have a good laugh at that. All right. Therefore, violation of its terms cannot alone give rights to Fourth Amendment challenges, as this court had already found. Oh, I bet he was laughing. I bet Judge Hitler was laughing at that. So what can I do about that? Search of the database is otherwise lawful. Suppression, therefore, is not warranted with regard to the database search. Based on the foregoing, the court denies defendant's motion to suppress genetic information. It is so ordered the 17th day of February 2025. So, look, they got there. They got there to Brian Kohberger quicker than they would have done had they not done some shady shit by, uploading that DNA to MyHeritage and to GEDmatch just to get a bigger sample. All right, to get a bigger sample, they got to Brian Kohberger. They'd have got to him anyway. They would have got to him anyway via his car. He was all over. He was running all over town. All right, before the murders, and then look, they'd have got to him. Now, whether Brett Payne lied in the PCA about the 29th of November, I don't know. Does it matter? As a consequence, if Brett Payne lied in the PCA about that fact, does it matter to the material facts of the case? If that paragraph had not been written in the PCA, would the judge still have signed that PCA? The argument is yes, based on all the arguments the judge made in the Franks denial, which I read on Saturday. So you could delete that paragraph that says that they knew Brian Kohberger's name from the 29th of November. You could delete that and still get that PCA signed. If so, then it doesn't change the material facts, and therefore the judge would still have signed the PCA, and all the search warrants that relied on that affidavit or affidavits of similar wording also don't get suppressed. So Nice try, but no cigar. Nice try, but no cigar. All right. I think most people who were in the chat earlier have now left the chat. This is too much. Do I think the legal team keeps bringing up laws that are from other countries and previously went? Oh yeah, oh yeah. Some of their filings when they go back to like ancient times. Like we get like a history of law. No, I don't think Brian's doing that. I think the defense team are using that kind of argumentation because it makes them look learned, because actually they don't have an awful lot to defend. When people use arguments that are so far away from the time, the space, the country, they're bringing up lots of different things, throwing lots of darts to the wall to see what sticks. It shows that they don't have a real argument. Whether Brian's having an involvement in it, whether Brian's participating in it, becomes irrelevant. The fact that it's not Brian that's signing this stuff, it's the attorneys. The attorneys are the people that put their names to it. Then that's that. I don't think it does. Oh yeah. Yeah. What you don't want is any precedent set that starts questioning the legality of collecting DNA from a crime scene. Ultimately, that's what you do not want. You do not want that to be challenged, because it's so well settled. You don't want that to be challenged in any way. Opening that door is very dangerous, potentially not just for solving crimes, but also for exonerating people who've been convicted of crimes who are rightfully innocent and should not be in prison. So it's dangerous. And then obviously with investigative genetic genealogy being new, there's only a few legal challenges to the use of it at the moment. So what you don't want is to set a precedent against it, because it is so very useful in solving crimes, also solving missing persons cases. You don't want to set a load of legal precedents against it when no law is being broken. If people are using it and literally breaking the law and breaking the, if you can't start using things willy-nilly, that's a slippery slope. And the FBI, not going against their own policies, yeah, that's a slippery slope. Don't go against your own policies. But why do you have the policies in the first place? If you're not going to abide by them, just don't have the policies in the first place. It's as simple as that. Simple as that. Exactly. The fact that Brian Kohberger has got caught out, well, I'm glad that his defence are putting up a good fight here. They write these long motions. The judge is responding with long responses, and it's what we need. We've got this transparency. We're finding out stuff in these motions, in these orders, that we didn't know previously, and nothing that I've read, nothing that I've seen has given me any pause at the moment to think, hold on a minute, he might be innocent. He might factually be innocent. At the moment, I'm not seeing it. Exactly. Not doing a judge goal. Yeah. Not doing a judge goal and just flat out denying, and you don't really understand why. this is very clear. Like, every argument is laid out. It's very clear. So, all right, guys, I've been on here for another 3 hours. I thought I could do this in 2, but no, another 3 hours. Now, these long lives, I know a lot of people don't like them because, you know, it's hard to concentrate when somebody's just reading from a document. It's hard to concentrate. I personally like listening to read-throughs, but I know a lot of people don't, and it's just too long and too boring. But these pre-trial motions, they make or break the case, because it determines what you're going to see at trial. And this is going to be like the trial of the year. This is going to be the biggest trial of this year. So all these pre-trial motions, what we're going to see at trial, this is so important. What goes in, what stays out, really important. Biggest trial of the year. So anyway, I am going to depart and go and do something else, maybe. Go and do something else. So thank you all for joining me. Thanks, as always, to the mods. Thank you to Aussie TV for gifting a membership. Didn't have any other donations by the looks of things. That's okay. So I shall see you tomorrow. All right, guys. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye for now.